Kalispera Seolus, Faristume Poli, and I'm afraid that's really the extent of my Greek, unless you take me to a taberna, in which case I actually am quite good at ordering food. Okay, now seriously, thank you very much for inviting us here today. We can see that this is a very hot topic at the moment. Particularly for us, as we're in the middle of doing a review of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. I will go into a little bit more detail on that later on. I will start by explaining a little bit what is the renovation wave, which is the policy context of the things we are trying to do right now. But I would also try and explain a little bit where it fits with the current legislative framework, so what we have already now in existence, and where we are moving in the coming months, and where we are moving actually very, very fast. Right, so renovation wave. As highlighted by our commissioner, it's really one of the key objectives of the coming years, and it's also something that we think can really help Europe come out of the crisis caused by COVID-19. It was launched in October 14th last year. It's a communication by the Commission to the Council and Parliament, really setting up what are our policy objectives, where do we want to be in the coming years, and what steps we're going to take in order to get there. But first, why renovation? Why do we keep talking about? Why have we launched this renovation wave, and why do we keep talking about renovation all the time? The fact is that in the EU, buildings represent approximately 40% of the total energy consumption, and they also represent about 36% of greenhouse gases emissions. They're the biggest sector in terms of energy consumption and greenhouse gases emissions. This means that whether we like it or not, if we really want to achieve our climate and energy objectives by 2030 and by 2050, we have to touch buildings. We have to do something about buildings. In addition, about 85% of the building stock in Europe is over 20 years old. That's a relevant figure because it's 20 years is more or less when we started having comprehensive standards for building construction in the EU. Before that, we had in some member states there were particular pieces of legislation addressing the buildings or building elements requirement, for example, minimum performance for boilers, or the installation of insulation, or requirements on at energy level on ventilation systems, etc. But really with the EPBD in 2002 is when we started having a comprehensive set of legislative measures and building codes that really address the building as a whole in terms of the energy performance. But 85% of those buildings were built before that. And approximately, we can see that compared to buildings built nowadays, they consume about twice as much energy as new buildings. In addition to that, we have approximately 34 million people living in energy poverty in the EU. That is people that they can't either keep their homes warm in winter, or they can't keep their homes cool enough in summer. This is really a problem that we are starting to see caused by climate change, amongst other things. But it's a real problem, particularly in the south, in Southern Europe. All of these links to where we want to be. We need to renovate buildings, and we've identified that only to achieve our objectives by 2030, we need to trigger an investment of 275 billion euros. And this economic stimulus is very important in the current situation. We are in the middle of a COVID pandemic, as you all know. Otherwise, we would be in Greece having these presentations, but we are all at home, and well, pretty much all of us, I think. Buildings have really become where we are most of the time. Before that, it was already calculated that we spend about 90% of our time in buildings. I think right now this is even more. So we spend all our lives in buildings. So we need to do something about it. In particular, also, we see that investment in buildings can be one of the triggers for economic recovery. It has buildings is a bit of a particular sector for the economy. It's very slow in terms of investments. They are usually long lead investments. There are also some of the investments that first drop when we are facing an economic crisis. In the economic crisis of 2008, for example, it took us, we dropped, I think it was by close to 50% in close to a year, and it took us a good 6 years to recover the economic activity in the building sector immediately. Sorry, it took us 6 years to recover the activity in the construction sector close to where we were in 2008. The construction sector, though, has a couple of characteristics that are very relevant in the current context. First of all, it's a very local activity. Most of the construction companies, at least in the EU, are SMEs or even micro SMEs. This is very small companies. Over 90% of them are in this fall in this category. So the employment tends to be local. The materials and the products are generally also local, or at least produced in the EU. So we see this working on the construction sector as really an opportunity to develop the local and regional economy. This combines with the fact that the benefits of building renovations are really felt at local level. So when we improve a building, when we generate energy savings, these benefits are felt at the level of the manager of the building, be it a school manager, for example, or an office manager, or in our own homes. It's a very direct benefit, but we're also very directly benefited by the fact that we are now in a much more modern, much healthier, and better performing building. There is a clear relationship with a good indoor environment and good indoor air quality, and the performance in our jobs or our performance in our day-to-day basis. So we really see the benefit of renovation, of triggering renovation at various levels. So the renovation wave, what it is? I mentioned before it was launched in 2020, 14th October, and it has two very simple objectives. The first one is we need to double the renovation rate in the next 10 years. And then we need to make sure that these renovations lead to higher energy and resource efficiency. This will have a series of consequences. The objectives are very simple. How we get there, that's a lot more complicated, I'm afraid. The main issue is that the current renovation rate is very low. Actually, the renovation rate of buildings is approximately 10% per year. That is, we renovate approximately 10% of our buildings per year. But what we call the energy efficiency renovation rate, it's much lower. It's only about 1%. That means that a lot of the renovations that are taking place already at the moment in Europe don't really touch and don't really affect the energy performance of a building. If we combine this with the fact that a lot of our building stock is inefficient, and that a large part of this building stock, between 85 and 95% of the buildings that we have today, will still be in use in 2050, really shows the fact that if we want to achieve our decarbonization objectives, we have to touch the existing building stock. And as I mentioned, we're only renovating about 1% of buildings per year. So in order to achieve our objectives for by 2050, you can see that we really need to increase the way we really need to increase the renovation rate of buildings. In practical terms, what the renovation wave means by 2030, for example, just to show you a few figures, is 35 million buildings should be renovated by 2030. There will be an additional number of green jobs created in the construction and the energy-related sectors. We calculate that approximately 12 to 18 jobs per every million euro invested. An important element to account is that this renovation wave is not just about purely renovating buildings, it's really about changing the way our buildings operate in practice. We want to decarbonize the heating and cooling sectors. We want to tackle energy poverty, and especially also tackle the worst performing buildings, two elements that are very closely related to one another. Then we also want to tackle public buildings and social infrastructure. We see a huge potential in the building sector, not just triggering this renovation rate, but also being one of the main key players. And in order to do all of these, we have to set up a number of policy measures, funding tools, technical assistance, and other measures in order to tackle these existing barriers, in order to make sure that the reason why we only renovate 1% of our buildings per year in terms of energy could be a lot more. So we need to tackle these the barriers associated with this. One thing that I forgot to mention in my latest slide is in my last slide, sorry, is the fact that this needs to be an integrated approach. We need to work at the EU level, but we also need to work with member states, with stakeholders, with regions, with municipalities, etc. All of us really need to work on this to make sure that we tackle all the associated barriers. The renovation wave highlights what we call 7 lead intervention areas. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail afterwards in some of them, but very, very quickly summarized. We need to tackle the what we call information, legal certainty, and regulation. So we need to provide a stable regulatory framework that really facilitates the building of business models that can then deliver these renovations. We also need to make sure that there is accessible and well-targeted funding. This is the most visible element is, of course, public funding, so grants, but we really also need to work with banks in order to make sure that financial institution put in place the necessary finance mechanisms, necessary finance products in order to make sure that we can achieve the objectives of the renovation wave. Because one thing that is very clear to us is that there is insufficient public money at the moment in order to carry out all these renovations. Other elements that we need to take into account, for example, very, very important is provide project and technical assistance and develop one-stop shops. We really need to help all the different actors in the supply chain, from policymakers to financial institutions to product developers to also project developers and the people that want to carry renovations in their homes. We need to help them and assist in this process, because carrying a renovation can be a very, very complex and arduous process. Other elements that we want to take into account is that these renovations need to be integrated, and they really need to transform the building into what we call a smart building. Not just that, but also we need to see a revolution in the construction sector, and we need to see developing it towards a more sustainable future. That means developing new products, but also training the buildings workforce in order to make sure that they know how to apply these products. And that goes from architects to engineers all the way down to people working on the construction site itself. One very, very important element for us to address, I mentioned it already, it's energy poverty, and make sure that we provide healthy housing. This is particularly important now in the context of the COVID pandemic. We need to make sure that the buildings that we are renovating are become healthier and more safe environments for living and working. And the final element is the what we call the decarbonization of the heating and cooling system as a whole. I will go now into a little bit more detail on some of them, but before that, just to mention that we focus particularly in what we call these 3 focus areas, not because we think that they are more important or that they are more relevant, but really because we think that acting on these 3 focus areas has the capacity to trigger the renovation wave, to really trigger this change to go from 1% renovation rate to at least double that. There are various reasons for it. For public buildings, for example, we think that the fact that public buildings are normally centrally managed, there is already a certain level of facilities management and managing of the stock as a whole that really helps in the procurement process, in the planning and the management of these works. But also we need to work on energy poverty and heating and cooling, because these are 2 very key and important areas. So in terms of the lead intervention areas and what we're doing into each one of them. So a little bit more detail on these measures, but please bear in mind that these are very broad objectives and that a lot is being done on each one of them. So, for example, I mentioned the regulatory framework. One of the things that we're looking is to develop stronger regulation. This is directly related right now, for example, with the review of the EPBD. And one of the things that we're looking for is how to address the worst performing building stock. So, for example, the possible introduction of a mandatory minimum energy performance standards for existing buildings. We're also looking, for example, on how to update the energy performance certificates. I will definitely go into more detail about this later on. And then we're also looking at a possible extension of building renovation requirements for the public sector. So in case you don't know about it, buildings managed by, the central government under the obligation to renovate 3% of their buildings per year. That's only the central government buildings. We are looking into maybe extending this obligation to other parts of the public sector. I mentioned before funding. There are two very important streams here. First is the public money or public EU money. We have the Next Generation EU, the Renovate and Power Out flagship under the Recovery and Resilience Facility. This is the instrument to really trigger the recovery of the EU economy following the COVID pandemic. This combines at the same time with all the cohesion funding available under the European Regional Development Funds and under the so-called cohesion funds themselves. This is all EU money that we're really encouraging member states to target towards building renovation. And so far as we can tell, it really looks that member states are listening to us, and they are putting a lot of this publicly available money into building renovation. A lot of this is to be confirmed in the coming months. But at the same time, I mentioned before private finance. So we are working with private finance, for example, to make sure that we simplify the rules for combining different funding streams. So to combine, for example, public and private finance. And we're also working with financial institutions to really incentivize them to use private financing. For example, the EIB is working very, very hard on working with other banks to make sure that there are financial products available for building renovation. Unfortunately, banks are still a bit hesitant to invest on energy efficiency. It's not so much because they don't see it as a feasible business model. They do see the importance and the scope of it, but they're not so used to working in this kind of business, and that creates a little bit of reticence. So we are working with them to make sure that they get used to these kind of business models, and where we see problems that could be resolved at regulatory level, we work on them. Other elements that we're looking for example, I mentioned before the buildings workforce. So we need to really make sure that we increase the capacity to prepare and implement these renovation projects. In general, the supply chain is capable of increasing the current renovation rate, but they are not quite there at the level of making sure that we can at least double the renovation wave. So we really need to train new workers and not just train new workers, but also update the existing workforce in order to make sure that they can work with the new technologies, with the new approaches, and make sure that they deliver what they are supposed to deliver. That links with the next part, which is to make sure that the market is ready to supply the necessary construction products and services. And here the sustainable element is very, very important. So support to sustainable materials and nature-based solutions is very important in the coming years. In order to do this, for example, we're looking into revising the legislation on marketing of construction products, and also how we can facilitate material reuse and recycling platforms. One of the elements that we have noticed in the last few years, for example, is that yes, it's relatively easy to recycle building materials, but it's very difficult to gather the building materials from the site that is being demolished or is being renovated, take them to our recycling plant, and then get them reused again. And that's sometimes something related purely to building permits or to waste permits. So we are working on that area too. And finally, for the renovation wave, one important element is that we need to stop thinking about individual buildings, or we need to stop trying to solve the building stock by working building by building. We really need to start thinking on a neighborhood-based approach. A lot of the times, one building may have an excess of heat, or may have an excess of renewable energy generated in the building, and that can be used by the buildings nearby. So we really need to start thinking about this integrated approach with different buildings, and not just think on our own buildings as a standalone element. One of the things that we're looking at this, for example, is what we call the Affordable Housing Initiative, which will try to trigger the renovation of 100 districts, particularly affected by issues such as energy poverty or lack of access to affordable housing. Now, on the existing legislative framework, the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, is really the main instrument that we have at EU level in order to address the building performance. It has a number of elements in it, and they are all really working on this energy performance approach. So we start by having the building as a whole, as such, and what we need to provide for this building in terms of a comfortable environment inside, a comfortable and healthy environment, and then how can we make this as energy efficient as possible. For that, there are a number of measures. We have what we call the minimum energy performance requirements, which are linked to cost optimal models. So these minimum energy performance requirements are linked to calculations that ensure that these requirements make sense from an economic perspective over the lifetime of a building. So these are calculations that set the requirements over calculations that take 20 to 30 years. So it's not just the immediate investment on energy efficiency, is what this investment will trigger in terms of energy savings over the lifetime of the building. We've got, of course, energy performance certifications. We've got nearly zero energy buildings, which are now the common standard in the EU. And we also have measures such as inspections of heating and air conditioning systems, and also measures in terms of technical systems, for example, installation of thermostatic regulating valves in individuals. Not thermostatic regulating valves. Temperature control systems in individual rooms, provision of charging points in buildings, etc. One thing that I think it's very important to highlight on all of this is that we are still talking about a directive. So it's very, very much linked to the principle of subsidiarity in the EU. This means that the directive sets a number of objectives and sets out a broad approach, but then it's really up to the member states to define exactly how they are going to do it. So the EPBD is not a regulation. It doesn't set exactly how everything needs to be done. On the contrary, it provides a number of options. It provides a broad scope for actions for the member states, because at the end of the day, member states, they have a number of existing building codes, they have an existing building stock, they have a way of doing things that is very different from member state to member state, and it's very difficult to provide a one solution that fits to everybody. And that's why we have a directive and not a regulation. The downside of this is that sometimes we end up with we have 27 member states in the EU at the moment. And sometimes we end up with even more than 27 different approaches, because some member states break this down to the level of region. But there is a reason for it, and it's something that we must take into account. So for EPCs, which is the topic of today, they are defined in the directive. They were already started in 2002, but they were really redefined in the recast of the directive in 2010. So first and foremost, the EPC is an information tool. It's there to provide information to a prospective buyer or tenant on how the building is going to, or how the building performs especially compared to the rest of the building stock. It is compulsory when selling or renting a building, and it must be shown to the prospective buyer or tenant, so they can make an informed opinion when they buy or rent a building. There is also an obligation to show in advertising media. And for public buildings or buildings frequently visited by the public, there is also an obligation to display this energy performance certificate at the door in a visible place in the building, so people that go in can see what is the performance of that particular building. So first and foremost, it's an information tool. It's there to show people what the performance of the building is. And sorry, I forgot this, which is also very, very, very important. It has to introduce a number. Sorry, the EPC has to have a number of recommendations to highlight how can this building be improved. This is particularly important in the residential sector. It gives ideas to people. This is what you can do with your building to make it a lot better. Other characteristics of the EPCs are it has to be produced by qualified independent experts. Who is a qualified independent expert is defined by each member state, and the EPCs are subject to an independent control systems. So there is a quality assessment of the EPCs. The rating it's common in a way. It has a common indicator, which is kilowatt hours per square meter per year of primary energy, and additional ratings may be used. So for example, some member states use the rating of kilograms of CO2 per square meter per year. So these indicators common, but the rating, that is the letter, or how they compare or how they carry out this benchmarking, that's particular to each member state. So unfortunately, this means, for example, that an A-rated building in Ireland is different from an A-rated building in Spain. They don't have the exact same number in terms of kilowatt hours per square meter. But it's also important to highlight that comparing the different classes, a building which is C-rated in Greece will always be better than an E-rated building in Greece, and that is common across all member states. But again, it's very important to highlight the fact that there are very different practices and culture. It's not just a matter of climate. It's not just because Finnish buildings are very different from Spanish buildings. It's also because, for example, Spanish buildings are very, very different from Greek buildings, even though we share a lot of the climate. I'm always a little bit ashamed when I go to Greece and I see that pretty much every single building has PV panels or solar thermal panels installed, and then when I go back home to Spain, that's more the exception rather than the norm, unfortunately. So in terms of what's happening with EPCs right now, where we currently have a coverage between 10 and 60% of the building stock, depending on the member state. So there are huge differences. Important though, it is a representative sample. We are finally able to gather information about the building stock, and we are starting to know more or less where we are. Because until now, we had very, very limited information on the general energy performance of buildings. In general, it's already difficult to gather information about the building stock as such. But now at least we are also gathering information about how it performs in terms of energy. Bear in mind that, for example, not all member states have an inventory of their building stocks. Not all member states have what we call a cadastre. I think Greece introduced it not so long ago. In addition to this, most member states at the moment make some of the EPC information publicly available. This is, of course, subject to privacy legislation, which is stricter in some member states compared to others. Greece, for example, has a very good EPC database, and they share some of the information in this database, which I think it's very, very important. What we're starting to see, particularly in relation to the real estate, is that a better EPC results in a higher value for the property, and also a shorter time to sell or a shorter time to rent. The difference was, I think, something like 10% over 2 EPC levels in one study compiled a few years ago. I don't have more recent information on this. But what we do see is this correlation between the value of an EPC, sorry, the value of the property and the rating on an EPC. Important here to highlight, real estate valuators have told us, and that's absolutely true, correlation does not mean causation. It's not that there is more intrinsic value in energy performance of a building, but it is the case, and they recognized it, that an energy performant building, it's a better building. It's got better quality of installation, it's got better quality of materials, and the general level of workmanship, it's better. So in general, what we do see is as good is this relationship between energy performance and quality. We also see lately that there are a number of initiatives in member states to link the EPC with specific schemes to address the worst performing buildings. In particular, these are schemes that aim to take out from the market buildings that are poor performing. So, for example, in the UK, which is no longer a member state, sorry, but it's a good example. In the UK, buildings that have a poor EPC rating can no longer be put in the rental market. And that's really a straightforward approach to take out those buildings and make sure that they are renovated as soon as possible. So what's coming now for EPCs in 2021? And with this, I am almost finished. EPCs are an integral part of the revision of 2021. This revision is very, very targeted with the objective of supporting the renovation wave and supporting this renovation process. So we are looking at ways to improve the EPCs in their role as an information tool. So how can they provide better information? Which additional indicators we can use that really help people understand what is the performance of the buildings and what they can do in order to improve it. We also want to look into measures to improve the quality, so make sure that they are really representative of the building, but also to improve the coverage. So how can we do it so there are more EPCs available? And then we're also looking at how to make sure that the information contained in these EPCs, and particularly in the EPC databases, is available and accessible to other initiatives. This is particularly relevant at the moment, for example, because we are developing the EU Green Taxonomy. This will define in the very near future what is considered a green investment or not. And there the EPC is very, very important because it really tells us this is the performance of the building, but it can also help us understand how does this building compare and how is it benchmarked with other buildings, because only the top performing buildings will be classified as part of these, could be qualified as green investments. We can also see that the EPC can link to other assessment tools. For example, it can link to the smart readiness indicator, which measures the smart readiness of a building. It can also link with other tools, for example, levels, which measures the embodied carbon of a building. So we see very, very important to develop these links with other assessment tools. So just the final point, we now have this revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. It's a very fast revision. We're working very hard on it. We have currently an open public consultations. The link is available on the presentations. I really invite you to and encourage you to participate in this open public consultation. Have a look there. The individual measures that I measured are explained in more detail, and you can really tell us what you think can be done, if we're missing something, if you think that this element is more important compared to this other element, etc. We are also carrying out an important stakeholder engagement, particularly with professional associations and product manufacturers and members of the supply chain of the building sector. And this is taking place right now. We have a meeting with them tomorrow, for example, to discuss some of these elements. And the objective of all of these is that we will have a Commission proposal before the end of the year. And then we take this Commission proposal and we start discussing it with the European Parliament and with the European Council to take it to the next step, which is to really have a revision of a directive, which will then transform into national law, which is the next step after this. And with this, I finish the presentation.